Abraxas isn't a god of light. He's not a god of darkness. He's the collision point of both. He's the force that ancient traditions were terrified to categorize because he does not fit the script. He does not obey the cosmic hierarchy. He does not kneel to anyone's version of morality. While most belief systems split the universe into neat boxes, holy and unholy, righteous and wicked, creator and destroyer, Abraxas burns the entire filing system. He embodies everything at once, unapologetically. And that's exactly why he rattles the cages of every doctrine built on control. You've been fed the same pattern your whole life, good up here, evil down there, and you in the middle, trying to survive the rules. But Abraxas annihilates that model in one move. Imagine a force that doesn't need to pick a side because it is both sides. Imagine an entity that doesn't ask for obedience because it doesn't care. Imagine something that isn't trying to judge you, save you, punish you, or test you because it's operating on a level where those ideas look like children's toys. That's Abraxas. That's why his name sits like a loaded weapon inside the oldest esoteric systems. The iconography alone is enough to tell you this being isn't here to play nice. A rooster's head, symbol of time itself, the one force that outruns every god, every demon, every creation myth. A human torso, consciousness, awareness, selfhood, the spark every system tries to claim ownership over. Serpent legs, raw primordial energy, untamed, unfiltered, older than any theology that pretends to cage it. And in his hands? A whip and a shield. Authority and sovereignty. Command and protection. Power and power again. No submission. No higher throne above him. This isn't just symbolism, it's a statement. Abraxas doesn't fit into reality. Reality fits into Abraxas. You know why ancient teachers were terrified of this figure? Because Abraxas doesn't follow the script of cosmic obedience. He doesn't reinforce the hierarchy. He breaks it. The systems built on fear, loyalty, punishment, reward, those systems collapse when confronted with a force that doesn't recognize their legitimacy. Abraxas is the one who stands outside the moral architecture entirely. He doesn't punish desire, doesn't reward obedience, doesn't support the illusion that there's a single correct way to move through existence. Instead, he embodies the full spectrum, creation, destruction, chaos, order, and fuses it into one unstoppable axis. When ancient mystics tried to describe Abraxas, they didn't soften the edges. They didn't try to make him relatable. They called him the power above the archons, above the rulers of the material realm. They saw him as the force that even the builders of worlds had to answer to. Not because he was kinder, not because he was crueler, but because he was beyond. You can't bribe Abraxas with worship. You can't threaten him with damnation. You can't appeal to him with moral arguments. He doesn't operate in that sphere. He's the code beneath the code, the level where existence itself is scripted. And if you think I'm exaggerating, look at the mathematics embedded in his name. Not poetry. Not metaphor. Mathematics. The letters of Abraxas add up to 365. One number for every day in the full cosmic cycle. One number that symbolizes total dominion over time, rotation, movement, inevitability. No other entity in the ancient world carried that numerical signature. None. Abraxas wasn't carved into the mythos as a character. He was installed as the blueprint. When you speak his name, you're not calling on a personality, you're calling on the architecture of reality itself. Think about how different this is from the stories you grew up with. Most divine figures are assigned jobs: creator, destroyer, savior, judge, ruler, rebel. Abraxas refuses all of them. He's not the light. He's not the shadow. He's the current that runs through both. The ancients saw him not as a guardian or a monster but as the force that sits at the center of all contradiction. He is the yes and the no, the ascent and the fall, the birth and the rupture. He is everything your doctrines split apart, reunited in one being. Let's break this down even harder, because the power of Abraxas isn't in the imagery alone, it's in what he represents. When a system builds itself on binaries, it teaches you that one side must be chosen and the other side rejected. It gives you a story where you're supposed to align with good, avoid evil, obey the rules, and follow the script. But Abraxas tears the script in half. He embodies the idea that the universe isn't split, it's layered. It's mixed. It's interwoven. And the moment you understand that, the old stories lose their grip. Abraxas is not a rebel. Rebels need something to revolt against. Abraxas isn't destroying the system, he predates it. He isn't trying to challenge moral order, he existed before moral order was invented. He's not breaking the rules, he's the reason rules exist in the first place. When you stand in front of that idea, everything else feels small. The gods who demand worship. The demons who demand fear. The angels who demand obedience. All of them fit inside a hierarchy. Abraxas sits outside the hierarchy entirely. That's why he's dangerous. That's why he was buried in esoteric teachings. That's why his name never made it into the sanitized versions of myth. If you look at Abraxas and feel confused, good. You're supposed to. He isn't meant to be digested easily. He's meant to destabilize. To disrupt. To force you out of the binary worldview that was handed to you. Light versus dark. Order versus chaos. Pure versus impure. These categories collapse the moment Abraxas enters the room. Because he reveals that existence is not a battle between opposites, it's a fusion of them. The ancients who encoded his image weren't building a religion. They were building a warning label. This is the force behind forces, the power behind powers. And here's the wild part, Abraxas has no interest in being worshipped. Worship assumes dependency. Worship assumes hierarchy. Worship assumes you're below something. Abraxas doesn't operate vertically. He operates absolutely. You don't kneel to him. You confront him. You face the totality he represents. You try to comprehend a being who wields creation and destruction with the same hand, not because he chooses one over the other, but because both belong to him equally. If you think the universe is ruled by one supreme power, one creator, one final authority, you're about to watch that entire structure snap like a dry branch. Because in the old Basilidian systems, Abraxas wasn't just another deity on a long list. He was placed above the creators, above the rulers, above the jailers of matter, above every being that claimed dominion over the cosmos. And he didn't earn that position through mercy or morality. He earned it through raw scope. Through scale. Through a reach so vast the ancients had to invent 365 separate realms just to describe the territory under his command. When certain ancient traditions mapped the architecture of existence, they didn't imagine a simple heaven and earth. They imagined layers, huge, intricate, stacked levels of reality ruled by entities known as eons. These eons weren't angels. They weren't gods. They were cosmic engines, each governing a specific dimension of existence. And sitting above all of them, every single one, was Abraxas. Not as a judge, not as a shepherd, but as the one force that could command the entire structure in a single breath. The ancients didn't describe him as benevolent or malevolent, because that language didn't apply. Abraxas was the one who dictated the flow between realms, the one who oversaw the machinery that even the demiurgic forces depended on. The so-called creator of the material world, the figure many other traditions center everything around, was not at the top in this system. He wasn't even close. He was an operator inside a much bigger machine, a smaller ruler inside a structure controlled from above. And the presence above him was Abraxas. You can imagine how explosive that idea must have been to early thinkers who were already uncomfortable with the notion of a flawed material world. If the world was broken, if suffering was everywhere, then the creator wasn't perfect. And if the creator wasn't perfect, then he wasn't the highest. That's where Abraxas enters like a wrecking ball. He doesn't fix the problem. He explains it by being the force above the force that built the world. Picture this, 365 realms, each one ruled by a cosmic intelligence, each one functioning like a layer of existence. Now imagine a being who governs the entire stack, the full tower, from the first realm to the last. That's the scale we're talking about. A scale so massive the ancients didn't give him a throne, they gave him a number. They encoded him into mathematics, into the cycle of the year, into the totality of existence itself. Not because they wanted to worship him, but because they wanted to map the force that made sense of all the conflicting layers that came before. Abraxas wasn't symbolic. He was structural. He was the architecture those layers depended on to remain coherent. And if you're wondering how this power operated, here's the shocker: Abraxas didn't micromanage anything. He didn't sit above the layers giving divine commands like a traditional god. He didn't pass judgment or hand out laws. Instead, he controlled the motion, the flow, the current, the link between the highest and the lowest. Think about that. The entire cosmos, every realm, every eon, every archon was bound by the movement he governed. In some texts, early mystics described him as the Lord of the Year, but that wasn't about timekeeping or calendars. It was about cyclical power, the movement of existence itself, the pulse of reality, the rotation of cosmic influence from one realm to another. Abraxas didn't just rule the eons. He held the key that made them interact. Without him, the realms would freeze, separate, collapse into isolated chambers without connection. With him, they moved. They exchanged power. They transmitted influence across the entire cosmic stack. That's not the role of a deity. That's the role of a central engine. The force you don't worship, the force you have to acknowledge because everything in existence depends on its function. Now let's go even deeper. The demiurge, the builder of matter, was obsessed with control. With walls. With boundaries. With fixed laws and rigid architecture. But Abraxas wasn't chained to order or disorder. He didn't pick sides between chaos and structure. He allowed both to function. He permitted contradiction. He permitted paradox. This is why the ancients said Abraxas stood above all the archons. Archons enforced. They restricted. They maintained the borders of their realms with an iron grip. But Abraxas dissolved borders. He didn't shatter them, he made them permeable. He allowed what the rulers wanted to keep separate to overlap, mix, bleed, and interact. That's not benevolence. That's not cruelty. That's absolute authority. When mystics contemplated Abraxas, they didn't picture a being with a clear agenda. They pictured a force that allowed existence to stretch and twist without tearing. Everything the archons tried to contain, Abraxas allowed to move. Everything the demiurge tried to fix, Abraxas allowed to fluctuate. Everything the eons tried to maintain, Abraxas allowed to transform. His power didn't look like a crown. It looked like momentum. And the truly shocking part? Abraxas wasn't viewed as stable. He wasn't rigid. He was dynamic. A being that embodied contradiction so effortlessly that stability itself looked like a limitation. In some descriptions, he was the union of opposites. Not because he blended them into harmony, but because he could contain both without needing them to resolve. That is a terrifying idea for any belief system built on purity, on separation, on moral clarity. Abraxas makes those categories collapse instantly. You cannot call him good. You cannot call him evil. You cannot moralize him at all. He stands in a sphere where morality doesn't exist yet. Imagine the impact this concept had. If the highest power is beyond morality, then morality is not a cosmic absolute, it is an invention of lower realms. If the highest power is beyond duality, then duality is a construct imposed by limited rulers. And if the highest power sits outside creation itself, then creation is simply one segment of a larger structure. These ideas weren't whispered. They were detonated. They rewrote the cosmic map in a single stroke. Abraxas held dominion over 365 realms, but not as a king. As a nexus. As the point where all paths converged. as the presence that linked the upper and lower eons, that governed the flow of influence, that made existence multilayered instead of static. The demiurge built walls, Abraxas opened corridors. The archons restricted movement, Abraxas generated motion. The eons maintained stability, Abraxas introduced change. You're looking at a being whose authority operated through contradiction, not through order. And this is why Abraxas became the center of some of the most explosive ideas in ancient esotericism. He represented the force that made the entire cosmic hierarchy function while standing completely outside it. He represented the authority the demiurge couldn't reach, the power the archons couldn't contain, the energy the eons couldn't classify. The ancients didn't fear Abraxas because he was evil. They feared him because he made their categories irrelevant. They feared him because he represented the raw structure of the cosmos, a structure not built on obedience or punishment or purity, but on the coexistence of opposites held together by a force no lower being could comprehend. When ancient mystics encoded the name Abraxas with the number 365, they weren't making a poetic gesture. They were declaring that this being didn't just rule a realm, or a group of spirits, or a pantheon, he ruled the full cycle of existence. Every day, every layer, every rotation of the cosmic wheel. And they didn't do this by guessing. They embedded it into numerology systems so old and so precise that even the most rigid priesthoods took them seriously. You're not looking at symbolism. You're looking at an equation that terrified people who built entire religions around the idea of control. Every god you've heard of has a story. A birth, a war, a moment of triumph, a flaw, a weakness, a downfall. But Abraxas doesn't have a story. He has a number. And that number is bigger than any deity's myth. When the ancients assigned 365 to his name, that number didn't represent time, it represented totality. The full arc of existence. The complete circuit. The entire system, from the first spark to the last shadow. Most divine names carried small numbers, single digits, or combinations that symbolized virtues or roles. Abraxas carried a number so large it symbolized the whole structure. This wasn't an accident. This was a declaration of supremacy encoded in mathematics. A claim that Abraxas wasn't a participant in the cosmic drama, he was the one who contained it. So let me break it down in a way that hits you instantly. Imagine every god, every demon, every angel, every titan, every archon as characters inside a gigantic, absolute, all-encompassing system. Now imagine that system has a master number. One number that governs the cycle of energy, time, movement, transformation, decay, renewal. That number is 365. And the being whose name equals that number isn't inside the cycle, he is the cycle. Abraxas doesn't just oversee the cosmic order. He embodies it. That's the level we're talking about. And you know what makes this even more insane? The ancients didn't portray Abraxas as harmonious or peaceful. They portrayed him as volatile, contradictory, layered with forces that normally annihilate each other. Light and darkness. Creation and destruction. Order and chaos. Wisdom and violence. They didn't give those qualities to him individually, they fused them into one entity. Abraxas wasn't the god of opposites. He was the union that made opposites possible. When ancient philosophers tried to describe this, they didn't use soft language. They said Abraxas was both the highest and the lowest. The apex and the abyss. The one who generates and the one who devours. And the number 365 wasn't symbolic. It was structural. It represented the total range of all possible states a being could occupy. Let's push deeper. In these early esoteric systems, every deity, every spirit, every cosmic intelligence was assigned a number through isopsophy, the Greek system of letter-to-number calculation. But only one name added up to the full cosmic cycle. Only one name represented the complete spectrum of reality. That was Abraxas. If a god represented justice, that name carried a number tied to justice. If a god represented war, that name carried a number tied to conflict. Abraxas didn't represent one attribute. He absorbed all attributes. You've got to understand how explosive that is. In a world built on hierarchy, where every entity is locked into its assigned role, Abraxas was the one figure who broke out of the system. Every other power had limits, defined strengths and weaknesses. Abraxas had none. He was the being who held the total number, the total cycle, the totality of existence within his identity. Now here's where it gets even more brutal. Abraxas wasn't portrayed as a moral being. He wasn't good. He wasn't evil. Those categories didn't apply. He was the ultimate power behind both. Imagine a being whose left hand creates worlds and whose right hand burns them down, without hesitation, without conflict, without preference. That's Abraxas. A being whose nature doesn't rely on morality at all. A force that doesn't justify its actions because justification itself is a lower-level concept. In systems that tried to contain the universe within moral boundaries, Abraxas was the rupture point. The being that proved morality is a limited tool used by lesser powers. Because the number 365 didn't symbolize order or goodness. It symbolized completion. Completion includes everything: hope, horror, beauty, brutality, creation, annihilation. It includes the full range of what existence produces. Abraxas wasn't a ruler of part of the cosmos. He was the ruler of all states of the cosmos. Not just the pretty ones. Not just the righteous ones. All of them. Let me hit you with something stronger. Imagine the universe as a giant clock. The archons maintain the mechanisms. The demiurge forge the gears. The eons regulate the chambers. But the one who governs the clock's full rotation, the one who determines how the cycle turns from beginning to end, that's Abraxas. He isn't the builder. He's the force that makes the builder possible. He isn't the regulator. He's the force that makes regulation necessary. He isn't the judge. He's the force that makes judgment meaningless. This is why the ancients didn't describe him in emotional terms. They described him in mechanical terms, numerical terms, structural terms. When you give a deity a personality, you limit that deity. When you give it a moral role, you shrink its authority. Abraxas was given none of those things. He wasn't bound by narrative. He was bound by totality. Even the imagery of Abraxas, rooster head, human body, serpent legs, whip, shield, makes more sense through this lens. He wasn't designed to look holy or noble. He was designed to look complete. Every part of his form represents a different layer of existence: time, consciousness, instinct, authority, defense. He is the embodiment of a system where all pieces, even the contradictory ones, coexist. In many ancient systems, gods were protectors of order. Demons were agents of chaos. Angels enforced purity. Serpents symbolized forbidden energy. But Abraxas held all of those powers at once. Because only a being with full numerical totality could contain forces that normally destroy each other. This is why Abraxas sits above the eons. This is why Abraxas commands more than the demiurge. This is why Abraxas makes entire pantheons look like subsets of a much larger equation. Abraxas is the 365, every realm, every vibration, every state, every possibility. The ancients weren't playing around when they encoded his number. They were signaling that Abraxas wasn't a character inside the myth. He was the myth's machinery. The engine that makes the contradictions of the universe function without collapsing. A being who can hold destruction without becoming evil. Who can hold creation without becoming good. Who can hold chaos without losing structure. Who can hold order without killing movement. Abraxas doesn't ease into your mind, he slams into it. His image isn't built to comfort you, inspire you, or reassure you. It's built to confront you. It's built to snap the spine of everything you thought divine imagery was supposed to be. So let's punch straight into this. When you look at Abraxas, you aren't looking at a holy figure. You're looking at an encoded system of power, stitched together from symbols that were never meant to coexist. Every piece of his body is a weapon. Every detail is a challenge. Every part is a revelation that the universe is not orderly, sanitized, or morally curated the way you were taught. Abraxas is the blueprint of contradiction, the face of a cosmos that refuses to fit into one shape. Start with the head of a rooster. You might laugh for a second until you realize that in the ancient world, the rooster wasn't a barnyard animal. It was the herald of time. It was the creature that announced the arrival of dawn, the transition of night into day, the moment the world resets. A symbol that forces the cosmos to move whether it's ready or not. A creature that marks the rotation of cycles, the push of existence forward. Giving Abraxas the head of a rooster wasn't aesthetic. It was a declaration, this being commands time. Not metaphorically. Structurally. He stands at the pivot where darkness flips into light and light flips back into darkness. That moment doesn't belong to gods or angels, it belongs to the force that controls transition. That force is Abraxas. Now look at the torso, human. The most ordinary part of the image, and yet the most disturbing. Because in mythology, divine beings usually ascend above humanity. They take forms that distance themselves from mortals, wings, halos, animal bodies, monstrous limbs. But Abraxas has the audacity to keep a human core. Consciousness. Agency. Awareness. The part of existence that questions everything, the part that breaks systems, the part that refuses to submit blindly. The ancients were saying something loud. The power at the top of reality isn't separate from consciousness, it contains consciousness. You're not looking at a god pretending to be human. You're looking at a cosmic force that includes humanity inside its identity. Abraxas doesn't rise above the human condition, he absorbs it. And that alone tears hierarchy apart. Then it gets darker. The legs, serpents. Not one. Two. Twisted, coiling, ancient, primordial. The serpent was never simply a symbol of evil. It was older than the concept of evil. It represented raw life force, energy that moves without permission, instinct that doesn't bow to anyone's commands. The serpent goes where it wants, strikes when it chooses, sheds its skin, transforms, renews, disrupts. It is the symbol of forbidden knowledge, primal intelligence, and untamed power. When you give Abraxas serpent legs, you're saying something brutal. This being walks on chaos. He stands on instinct. He moves through the world with the base-level power all gods pretend to control but secretly fear. The serpent isn't underneath him. It is him. And that means Abraxas isn't built on holiness. He's built on raw, undiluted force. Then come the hands, one holding a whip, the other a shield. These aren't symbolic props. These are cosmic statements. The whip is the instrument of command. Not command through persuasion or righteousness, command through raw enforcement. Through the ability to compel movement. To drive the cycle forward. To punish stagnation. To enforce the laws that existed before morality was invented. When the ancients gave Abraxas the whip, they were saying, this being forces cosmic motion. He doesn't ask the universe to turn. He makes it turn. The shield is the opposite, defense, containment, protection of the structure. Not moral protection. Not spiritual shelter. Structural protection. The shield symbolizes the ability to maintain the integrity of the cosmos even when it's tearing itself apart. It is the emblem of sovereignty, of self-sustaining power. Abraxas doesn't seek protection, he wields it. He doesn't need guarding, he is the guardian of the system itself. The whip makes the cosmos move. The shield keeps it from disintegrating. He is motion and stability fused into one. Now look at these symbols together: rooster head, human torso, serpent legs, whip, shield. None of them belong on the same being. None of them come from the same symbolic universe. None of them serve the same spiritual agenda. But that's the point. Abraxas isn't an aesthetic composition. He's a coded message. He is contradiction embodied. He is the union of forces that should cancel each other out. And the fact that he holds them all simultaneously is the entire lesson. The highest power is not pure, not moral, not orderly. The highest power is the force capable of containing the totality without collapsing. Most gods are simplified, distilled into archetypes. The god of war, the god of love, the god of wisdom, the god of death. But Abraxas refuses reduction. He is all of them at once. He is war and wisdom and chaos and order and time and instinct and consciousness. He is the whole spectrum of existence compressed into one form that breaks every rule of divine anatomy. That's why his image is shocking, not because it's grotesque, but because it's complete. The rooster screams time into motion. The human body anchors consciousness. The serpent's pulse with primordial power. The whip drives the cosmic engine. The shield protects the framework. This isn't mythology. This is a map of the universe disguised as a creature. Most ancient deities were designed to comfort, inspire, or threaten. Abraxas was designed to reveal, to expose the architecture beneath creation, to show that the cosmos is not ruled by purity or simplicity, but by forces that merge contradictions into power. The rooster head says, cycles move because I command them. The human torso says, consciousness is part of my identity. The serpent say, chaos is the base layer of existence. The whip says, motion is enforced by my authority. The shield says, structure exists because I hold it together. Abraxas doesn't symbolize balance, he symbolizes dominion over imbalance. He doesn't symbolize harmony, he symbolizes the ability to contain disharmony without being consumed by it. Every part of his iconography is a confrontation with the idea that the universe should be clean, linear, and morally consistent. Abraxas laughs at that idea. His form is the answer to the question no ancient priest wanted to ask: what does the real engine of existence look like when you strip away the stories? It looks like a rooster, a man, two serpents, a whip, and a shield. It looks like a being made from every cosmic law at once. It looks like contradiction forged into sovereignty. It looks like the one force that doesn't need your understanding to exist. In the Gnostic systems that dared to name him, Abraxas wasn't a god among gods. He wasn't a rival to angels or a challenger to demons. He was the force outside the architecture entirely. The one presence the demiurge couldn't cage, couldn't command, couldn't predict. And that's exactly why these ancient thinkers placed him where no other entity dared to stand, far above the maker of the material world, above the archons who enforce cosmic law, above the entire machinery that pretends to be divine authority. The demiurge, the so-called creator of matter, was obsessed with control. He wanted order so rigid it suffocated everything under it. He wanted purity, obedience, structure, hierarchy. He wanted a universe that bowed to him and a humanity that feared his judgment. But Abraxas wasn't part of that system. He wasn't created by it. He didn't answer to it. He didn't even recognize it as legitimate. To Abraxas, the demiurge wasn't a god. He was a bureaucrat, an engineer of a prison he mistook for a masterpiece. And this is where the narrative hits with full force. Abraxas is the being who pierces that prison. Not to save anyone. Not to punish anyone. But because his existence exposes the lie at the center of the demiurge's authority. The lie that creation is perfect. The lie that morality is absolute. The lie that the material world is the highest stage of reality. The Gnostics saw the demiurge as a limited craftsman, blind to the higher realms, intoxicated by his own power. But Abraxas? Abraxas didn't need to overthrow him. He made him irrelevant. This is the part most people can't handle. Abraxas wasn't framed as a lightbringer or a destroyer. He was framed as the breaking point of all categories. The moment you try to classify him, the system collapses. And that terrified ancient theologians who relied on clean lines, good versus evil, divine versus profane, creator versus creature. Abraxas stands exactly where those lines dissolve. He doesn't sit above the demiurge like a benevolent overseer. He sits above him like a force that does not acknowledge the demiurge's rules, hierarchy, or obsession with purity. The Gnostics depicted the demiurge as a jealous ruler, desperate to keep humanity locked inside material illusion. But above him were the archons, and above the archons were the eons, and above the eons was the pleroma, the fullness of reality. Abraxas wasn't placed inside this spectrum. He was set across it. A presence so vast that categorizing him as light or dark was laughable. You cannot force an infinite paradox into a moral checkbox. In some traditions, Abraxas was the point of contact between the highest realms and the lowest depths. The being who allowed forces from above and below to intersect. The demiurge built walls. Abraxas broke them. Not violently, structurally. He allowed pathways where the demiurge enforced barriers. He allowed contradiction where the demiurge demanded purity. He allowed motion where the demiurge demanded immobility. He was the one force that refused to let the universe stagnate under a blind creator trying to freeze everything in a rigid moral grid. And that's the part that strikes hardest. Abraxas wasn't framed as a liberator. Liberation is a moral concept. He wasn't framed as a conqueror. Conquest is a hierarchical concept. He wasn't framed as a judge. Judgment is a doctrinal concept. He was framed as the force of totality, a being whose nature includes everything the demiurge tried to separate. The demiurge split the universe into binary categories to maintain control. Abraxas crushed those binaries simply by existing. Let's break this with full intensity. The Gnostic worldview saw the demiurge as a being terrified of his own limitations. He created matter to assert dominance. He demanded worship to compensate for insecurity. He imposed law because he couldn't handle contradiction. And he surrounded himself with archons to enforce his authority. But the moment Abraxas enters the equation, that entire structure looks small. You cannot have absolute authority in a cosmos where Abraxas exists. Imagine the demiurge standing on a throne made of rules he invented, holding worlds he assembled through brute force, convinced he is supreme. Then imagine Abraxas, a being that contains the essence of creation and destruction simultaneously, a being that transcends the boundaries that give the demiurge his power, stepping into view. Not to dethrone him. Not to challenge him. But simply to exist. And through that existence, everything the demiurge built becomes exposed as limited, incomplete, childlike. That is why Abraxas terrified the teachers of orthodoxy. Not because he was evil, but because he made their god look provincial. In several Gnostic interpretations, Abraxas was so far above the archons that the archons couldn't comprehend him. They enforced laws that didn't apply to him. They guarded boundaries he could walk through. They punished rebellion, but he contained rebellion and obedience within himself. This wasn't duality. This was integration. Abraxas wasn't two sides of a coin. He was the metal the coin was forged from. Now focus on this. Abraxas wasn't described as merciful or cruel. He wasn't described as loving or hateful. He wasn't described as a being who wanted followers. He had no interest in devotion. Devotion is the currency of limited gods. Abraxas didn't want worship because worship implies dependency, and dependency has no place in a being who represents the totality of existence. The demiurge needed worship. The archons needed submission. The angels needed obedience. Abraxas needed nothing. That is the deepest threat. A god who needs nothing cannot be bribed, cannot be manipulated, cannot be understood through moral categories. He stands outside every system dependent on fear, reward, purity, or doctrine. He is the being who renders those systems obsolete. And here's where the intensity spikes. Abraxas was not merely beyond the material world. He was beyond the spiritual hierarchy itself. The demiurge ruled matter. The archons ruled domains. The eons ruled dimensions. Abraxas ruled the connection between all layers. The contract between light and darkness runs through him. The link between consciousness and instinct runs through him. The tension between creation and destruction runs through him. He is the conduit, not the participant. In the Gnostic narrative, the demiurge imagines himself the apex of existence until you introduce a being like Abraxas. Suddenly the demiurge isn't a supreme creator. He's one step in a chain he doesn't understand. He's a local authority inside a cosmic architecture that doesn't answer to him. Abraxas is the presence above the blueprint, the one force that contains everything the demiurge tried to divide. And that's the heart of Part 5. If Abraxas wasn't dangerous because he opposed the demiurge. He was dangerous because he made the demiurge irrelevant. Abraxas didn't break the hierarchy. He revealed it was never absolute. He didn't destroy the structure. He exposed that the structure was only one layer in a much larger system. He didn't rebel against cosmic law. He embodied the power that makes cosmic law possible. Abraxas moved through the realms the demiurge thought he owned. He crossed boundaries the archons thought they controlled. He contained energies the eons thought they defined. Abraxas steps into this final segment like a shockwave, not a character. Because the moment you reach the upper edges of ancient cosmology, past the demiurgic framework, past the layered heavens, past every neatly labeled spiritual authority, there's one presence that refuses to be contained. Not as ruler. Not as savior. Not as enemy. But as the pressure point where all cosmic forces converge. That's where Abraxas operates. You're not looking at hierarchy anymore. You're looking at the point where hierarchy collapses under something bigger, heavier, and infinitely more complex. When early esoteric systems tried to map the highest layers of existence, they ran into a problem. Everything they described had limits. Even the exalted beings with radiant forms, even the rulers of vast dimensions, even the architects of spiritual domains, they all had boundaries. Their nature stopped somewhere. Their authority ended somewhere. Their identity pointed in one direction. And in a cosmology obsessed with categorizing every power, that limitation was inescapable. But then came the figure that wasn't defined by a single direction. A force not built from purity, or order, or enlightenment, or destruction. A force that held all directional vectors without committing to any of them. That force was Abraxas. The being ancient teachers could describe only by contrast, not this, not that, not confined, not divided. A presence whose scope made even the most revered spiritual intelligences look like gears in a machine they didn't design. What made Abraxas impossible to place wasn't power, it was range. The archons had function. The eons had domain. The demiurge had territory. Abraxas had none of that because he didn't need it. His presence wasn't anchored to one role or one layer. He occupied the gaps. He filled the spaces the other beings couldn't reach. He moved in the zones that were structurally excluded from the rest of the hierarchy. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't transcendence. It was something older than both concepts, a capacity to exist in all states without fracturing. And that's the part that hits hardest. Because the moment you try to articulate a being like that, your language breaks. The ancient writers didn't describe him with moral traits because moral traits require boundaries. They didn't describe him with emotional traits because emotions require direction. They didn't describe him with doctrinal traits because doctrine requires consistency. Abraxas wasn't consistent. He didn't need consistency. He didn't operate through harmony or conflict, he operated through totality. A form of existence that doesn't choose and doesn't reject. It just is in the most absolute way possible. This is why every attempt to compress Abraxas into symbolism ends up exploding into something bigger. You try to pin him to a single meaning, the meaning slips out of your hands. You try to define him, the definition dissolves. You try to categorize him, the category shrinks under the weight of what you're trying to contain. Abraxas is the escalation point. The moment the framework fails. And when the framework fails, the beings inside it begin to reveal their limitations. The archons hold authority only within their zones. The demiurge exercises power only within his construct. The luminous eons radiate influence only within their band of existence. But Abraxas is the one presence that ignores those borders completely. Not because he passes through them, because they don't apply to him. The concept of inside and outside doesn't map onto a being that contains both states simultaneously. This is why ancient esoteric circles treated Abraxas with a type of awe that didn't resemble worship. Worship didn't make sense. Worship implies hierarchy, and hierarchy implies limitation. Abraxas operated beyond that. The appropriate response, according to the texts that dared to mention him, wasn't loyalty or fear, it was recognition. Recognition that the highest force in the cosmic structure wasn't clean, idealized, or moralized. It was vast, unfiltered, and structurally embedded in everything. Abraxas exists at the level where contradiction stops being a problem and becomes a feature. Forces that cancel each other out in lower realms coexist effortlessly in him. Ancient systems couldn't reconcile this. They weren't designed for a being who doesn't follow the logic of their universe. So instead of describing him in narrative terms, they described him in relational terms. Abraxas was the presence before which all distinctions collapsed. You see this in the way their language shifts when his name appears. The tone goes from mapping to confronting, from explaining to surrendering. Not because Abraxas demands surrender, but because the writers recognized that they were touching a concept that didn't need their metaphysics to exist. The archons needed metaphysics. The demiurge needed metaphysics. Abraxas didn't. He was the context those metaphysics were built inside. This creates a tension that no other being in the Gnostic cosmology generates. The demiurge rules through possession. This is my world, my creation, my law. The archons rule through enforcement. This is our territory, our boundary, our function. Even the highest eons influence through projection. This is our radiance, our emanation, our expression. But Abraxas doesn't rule, enforce, or project. He saturates. He permeates. He acts as the connective tissue between states that cannot touch each other without collapsing. And here's the part that ancient teachers never said directly but always implied: Abraxas wasn't outside the cosmic hierarchy because he was too high for it. He was outside because the hierarchy was too small for him. When Abraxas appears in their descriptions, he isn't framed as a being who intervenes in cosmic affairs. He doesn't punish the demiurge. He doesn't rescue souls. He doesn't join battles. He doesn't settle disputes between realms. He doesn't act as judge or mediator or architect. He simply exists at a magnitude so complete that even the mechanics of the universe depend on him indirectly. The unspoken acknowledgement is that cosmic order is not ultimate. It is simply one layer of a much larger continuum, and Abraxas occupies the whole continuum, not the layer. This is why the ancient thinkers placed him at the top without describing him as a highest. Highest is a spatial term. Abraxas didn't occupy a point above others, he occupied the entire span of what above and below could even mean. That's why they gave him symbols instead of doctrines. That's why they used mathematics instead of myth. That's why he exists in their writings like a gravitational field rather than a personality. He isn't a narrative. He's a condition. And when they describe the reaction of other cosmic beings to him, it's not fear. It's not obedience. It's not devotion. It's incapacity. They cannot grasp him. They cannot categorize him. They cannot interact with him in any controlled way. Abraxas doesn't reject them. He simply doesn't operate on their bandwidth. Light cannot oppose him. Darkness cannot oppose him. Because opposition itself is a framework he doesn't participate in. And that's what gives Abraxas his final impact. He's the ultimate destabilizer of cosmic identity. A being who reveals that every title, creator, ruler, demon, angel, lawgiver, savior, is a local phenomenon. A label invented by limited entities inside one layer of existence. But Abraxas is the continuum where all labels dissolve. The system where every force functions without needing to justify itself. The presence that turns duality into architecture rather than conflict. Abraxas is the authority that doesn't need authority. The power that doesn't need obedience. The totality that doesn't need to choose a form. A cosmic force that neither uplifts nor destroys, because uplift and destruction are too small to define him. Thank you for watching this video until the end.